Hello everyone and welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Josh, joined as ever by Ewan Patterson, which can mean one of few things, and today it is Star Wars, because Jedi Fallen Order has had sort of a deep dive into it by game director Stig Asmussen on a podcast, and he's talked at length about the difficulties of creating the game while, staying true to what Lucasfilm, who ultimately have the final say on Star Wars games and what's included in them, like the creative differences between the two studios and how that influenced the development of Fallen Order. And there were some really interesting tidbits in there about how much they actually pushed back on the idea of it being a Jedi game at all, because apparently they're very, protective over the idea of Jedi and the Force powers and everything associated with that, and they didn't just want to give it to Respawn, who hadn't had any experience building a Star Wars game beforehand. I think Stig even said that, they are looking for people to earn the right to make a Jedi game, but you've looked at this more than I have, and I want to know everything about it because it's fascinating what goes into creating these licensed video games.
It's so interesting, Josh, because when me and Scott went down to London to actually play Jedi Fallen Order, we did interview Aaron Contreras, who was one of the, I think he was the lead narrative designer on the game, and he was talking about kind of the stuff that the back and forth that Respawn and Lucasfilm had going forward, and what they could include and what they couldn't include. And this is all down to Lucasfilm Story Group, who kind of marshal the entire Star Wars franchise, and basically in an attempt to make it a cohesive whole. You don't want stuff that contradicts other things, otherwise you're left with, a hodgepodge of different things that doesn't really, connote Star Wars. And that's a big issue. And when you're doing video games, which are naturally going to try different things, there are certain aspects or pillars of the Star Wars franchise that people want to avoid. And this is all really interesting because talking about the different challenges that they actually had going into this, they actually said when they came to Lucasfilm saying we want to do a game about a Jedi, they actually pushed back and said that we'd actually rather you did something with blasters and bounty hunters, which is interesting in the sense that every other EA game that had been optioned until that point had focused on a theme of scoundrels with blasters or bounty hunters with blasters or smugglers with blasters. So it's really interesting.
For me, that line clicked everything into gear for me. It made the whole Disney EA enterprise kind of makes sense because, like you said, all of the games that we've kind of had, including Battlefront to an extent, although they do feature heroes and villains as per the franchise, but games like Amy Hennig's Ragtag, which was cancelled, and even Star Wars 1313, they've all been focused on bounty hunters or certainly blaster wielders, and now it makes sense why. I just assumed that EA would have wanted to explore different parts of the universe and give us something we haven't seen before, really, because you do think of Star Wars and then you think of the Jedi, but it's so fascinating to me that that's a high up creative decision, that Jedi are almost kind of off limits until you can prove to us why you deserve to make a game like that.
It's interesting. I am curious to figure out whether or not this came about after Respawn had settled on the between episode 3 and 4 era. Obviously, we've talked at length regarding our discussions on Fallen Order and the future of Respawn's Jedi games, in the sense that when you set a game in that time frame, you are kind of limited rather by the sense of inevitability to the proceedings. Any Jedi that is around in between that gap is either going to have to disappear and do something else for the next 30 years, or is going to have to die because Luke Skywalker is the one and only hope, along with Leia later on in the series. I'm going to read out a quote from the podcast. It's really interesting. You can actually go check it out on Spotify. It's the AIAS Game Makers podcast, and you notice there were some really cool episodes on there as well.
Yeah, there's people like Neil Druckmann and Todd Howard and a bunch of cool, interesting creatives.
Yeah, it's cool. So basically what they said was they weren't super comfortable with the idea. I pitched, hey, what if we do a game about Jedi and Force powers? And they were not super comfortable with that. They threw it back and said, what about blasters and bounty hunters? That's not the background of the team we've built, Stig replied. You might as well have asked us to start building a racing game. At this point, and to be fair, I would kind of like a remaster of Star Wars Pod Racers.
I'd take it, yeah.
Not Bombad Racing, no, that we've done talk about that one, unless you're Ben Roy. I don't think anybody's going to be happy with the results of that. So then basically that is interesting. They talk about how they had to earn the right to actually have a Jedi game. And that was the big thing that me and Scott talked about as well, because if you recall before Fallen Order came out, there was loads of discussions over whether or not it was going to be a spiritual successor to the old LucasArts Jedi Knight games.
Yeah.
And we were talking to them about it. It was like, do we think is the link deliberate? And what Aaron told us was that basically, no, it was the Jedi thing was given to us when Lucasfilm felt that we had earned it.
Yeah.
So that is, again, it's interesting how protective they are over the Jedi and the Force in particular. It definitely seems as though in this new era of Star Wars, everyone is definitely trying to make sure that the Jedi have very specific things that kind of qualify a Jedi, not acting out in, wanton violence, for instance, making sure that you're using the Force in certain ways. And even though Jedi Fallen Order, you do play as a Jedi eventually, spoiler alert, for most of that game, he's a fallen, well, not a fallen Jedi, but he was a Padawan, his training was interrupted, he's still a Force user, he still has a lightsaber, but he's not the Jedi of yore.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to unpack in that quote, and what you just said for me is that I wonder how much EA already knew about the limitations, or at least challenges they'd be coming up against when they were going to Lucasfilm to create a Star Wars game, because I know when Stig Asmussen came on, they must have, the decision or the plan must have always been to create a melee-focused game, because he had history directing God of War 3, which is obviously, a big hack and slasher, big explosive hack and slasher. So I wonder whether they appointed him first and then kind of ran into a bit of trouble being like, oh, we built this team to make a melee-focused Jedi game, and now Lucasfilm are kind of being a bit strange about it. I wonder how much EA already knew about those limitations. And yes, like you said, I do think that when it comes to the Lucasfilm story group, you know more about it than me, but it seems with these most recent movies and the approach to the media outside of movies like video games, there seems to be a much tighter control over the story and how Jedi are characterized. Because it's a big theme, like you said, not only in the original trilogy with Luke and Leia being like the new hope and the only hope, but now we've seen the Jedi explored in the likes of The Last Jedi and what it means to be a Jedi and whether the Jedi should end, whether they're outdated, and all of that is so woven into the fabric of the sequel trilogy that it inevitably affects video games that are canon that then have to also wrangle with that while delivering a satisfying, power-driven game.
And that is interesting as well, because in those older Star Wars games like Jedi Knight to Jedi Outcast and later Jedi Academy, you could wield both dark side and light side powers. Yeah. It feels like that wouldn't necessarily gel with the current vibe that Story Group are going for. And to be fair, they have an amazing job in their hands. They basically have to chart the entire Star Wars franchise going forward, and they've done a pretty impeccable job of it so far. But one other thing that they mentioned in this podcast is that Respawn actually had numerous fights
with
Lucasfilm regarding this. And when we had the interview with Aaron down in London, he did mention that there were some things that they told that they couldn't actually do. I imagine that's going to be certain gameplay elements that would have been, maybe to do with the Force, maybe they wanted to introduce certain things, but Lucasfilm Story Group were like, well, no, Jedi can't do that. Jedi can't do this. So you basically have to work within those parameters, and that is kind of limiting, but also I feel as though Star Wars as a brand benefits from having that one coherent focus. And the other thing that I'm going to point out now as well is earlier this week we talked about the Project Luminous rumors and how that's going to be set in a brand new era called the High Republic, which is set 400 years or so before the Phantom Menace. I imagine they'll have more freedom to do what they want with there. If you're going to do a Jedi game set in that era, it's hundreds and hundreds of years until they actually fall. So you don't have to worry about characters having to basically get off stage before Luke Skywalker and Ben Kenobi start, messing things up on the Death Star.
And that's ultimately what makes me so excited for that new era, is just the freedom. I've never even thought about it that way in regards to kind of the power set in Fallen Order, because when I was playing through that game, you were discovering things, or rediscovering things like the Force Push and, stasis and similar powers. They're all things we've seen before, and they're all very fun to use, and Respawn got really creative in the way you can, chain them together to make combos. But I was kind of waiting for, something radical that I might not have seen in games before, and that never came. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I wonder whether that was one of the limitations of, look, we know how Jedi operate in this time period. We don't want to give you dark side powers because that's not the kind of game we want to make. That wouldn't gel with how we've set the Jedi up. And I do hope that when we get this High Republic era, that they can kind of go mad. Obviously, this still have to be in with a certain framework, but there hopefully should be more freedom to explore and make these kind of, radical decisions that were shut down. I don't know if any of these radical decisions would have been good. We unfortunately don't know what Lucasfilm actually said no to, but I can imagine, sometimes when you get licensed games, you always get the feeling that they're a little bit constrained, and the convoluted way you have to get things okayed from developer reports in the past seems to sometimes take just far too long to make an effective game. So I wonder how much that will change going into the future, and whether they are just more protective about this period, like you said, that's set between two distinguished, identifiable time periods.
I think that is the case, but I also genuinely think, we talked about earlier this week, both on this channel and on WhatCulture Gaming, about Star Wars being a very unique multimedia entity in the sense that you have everything interlinking with one another. The MCU is different in the sense that you have just the cinematic universe, and the Marvel Comics is off doing its own thing in its own universe. Star Wars is the same universe, whether you look into the games, whether you look into the comics, whether you look into the novels, and it's a really gratifying experience once you start meshing those different mediums together. I'm kind of getting more into the novel side of things now, and I'm basically getting a greater appreciation appreciation for what's going on, and it's really nice. So I think in that sense, we can talk about the limitations potentially, impeding certain things that developers want to do. But in the end, the more that people collaborate with Story Group on certain things, main Star Wars fans are going to get a more gratifying experience. They're going to get a more edifying conclusion of a greater feeling of cooperation, I feel, as well. And especially if we're going to something like Project Luminous and the High Republic, that's going to be even more apparent because they're working with a completely blank slate, a completely new time period that they're still teasing. The Rise of Kylo Ren comic this week actually mentioned the High Republic again, so that's really cool.
Okay.
So yeah, there's so much to be excited about going forward, and hopefully Respawn get more freedom there, even though we can't say one way or another whether or not they were impeded in a bad way.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think no matter how you kind of view this, it is an exciting time to be a Star Wars fan, which is kind of crazy considering that the Skywalker saga has just ended. It feels like everything is just opening up. But I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Have you listened to this discussion with Stakers Musson, and what do you think about the development of Falling Order, and are you looking forward to the High Republic era? Either way, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't, though, I've been Josh. You can follow me on Twitter at JoshBoone with 2 O's. This has been Ewan. You can follow him on Twitter at
Ewan Ruins Things.
And we will see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
I don't like you.
I don't like you either.